the Congress of South African Trade Unions, was extremely strong in the country. The mass democratic movement within the country was extremely strong. Popular working class structures emerged in the 1980s to resist apartheid, to refuse paying rent, because most black people in townships were not allowed to own their houses except for in Alexandra Township, and they had to pay rent to the state, and people started refusing to pay rent. There was a huge big rent boycott going on. There was all kinds of structures being organized, boycott strikes and so on throughout the 1980s. There were street committees, there were self-defense units, there were even popular courts and things like that that people had set up. Now, when the ANC came to power in 1994, it was as a result of the pressure that was put by people in working class communities on the apartheid government that forced that government to the negotiation table. But these popular struggles were not necessarily organized by the African National Congress. They emerged as struggles from the grassroots up. The African National Congress was in exile. It had a liberation army called Mkhonto weSizwe, which hardly did anything in the country. It had maybe one or two bomb attacks, one in Durban, another one or two in Pretoria, and so on. But it never really mobilized the working class. It never really mobilized popular resistance. And the popular resistance really came out of the trade union movement inside the country and out of the working class itself. And when the ANC negotiated the settlement, it came after a number of meetings that was held in West Africa. The last one that was held in 1986 in Kabwe in Zambia, and so on. And at these conferences of the ANC in exile, the big banking and big mining and the big corporations and so on participated. And basically, the agreement was that the ANC would rid itself of its Marxist and communist elements, except for the Communist Party, of course. The Marxist tendency was kicked out at Kabwe in 1986, and the ANC set itself up for negotiations from a conservative platform. And that conservative platform basically agreed in 1994 at the Kempton Park and Codesa conferences that once the ANC comes to power, it would leave the economic base of society completely unchanged. But apartheid itself, the thing of you not being able to go to the movies because you're black, you're not being able to go to a restaurant because you're black, you're not being able to go to suburban schools or buy a house in the suburbs because you're black and so on. All those things would be removed, but the economic ownership of the country was not changed at all. So much so that we still have a situation where the ownership is largely concentrated in foreign multinational corporations and a small minority of people in the country, leading to the most unequal society on the planet. And the economy under apartheid and colonialism was really based on a cheap labor system. And that cheap labor system has persisted. And the majority of the people still find themselves in urban ghettos called townships, in squatter camps that are now referred to as informal settlements, and in substandard housing with very poor education facilities, very poor health facilities, very poor infrastructure where the majority of people live. And that is like, there's a gaping canyon between those people and the people who are living in the suburbs, which are still largely white. And the townships are essentially black. I don't think that there are even 1% of the white population present in any townships and so on. So that apartheid has not really gone. The old iron fist apartheid might be gone, but now you have a kind of a velvet glove apartheid, which says that black people can participate in sport on an equal basis. They can go to any schools they like. They have access to the universities that they were restricted from under apartheid and so on. but really in terms of economic power, the power still resides with a ruling class which is racially defined. So there's a overlap between class and race in this country, which is extremely unhealthy, and that overlap basically persists. Now, by 1998, 99, 2000, the ANC youth became very, very disillusioned with the situation because they didn't really see any change taking place. And the country passed laws like the Minerals Petroleum Resource Development Act and so on to try and create conditions for Black or African participation in the economy, setting up a situation where different industries develop charters, and according to those charters, the African population would be allowed to participate, but they would be allowed to participate as 27% shareholders. And so companies had to fill in a scorecard, a Black Economic Empowerment scorecard, to demonstrate that they've got 27% African or Black participation in their shareholding, which is absolutely insane because in actual fact, that turns the majority, the political majority, the demographic majority in the country into an economic minority. It is still based on the notion of private property, which is also a clause in our constitution, unfortunately, that private property is sacrosanct. So the only way that Black people can participate is through participating in the private ownership of the means of production, but only 27% of that private ownership. And so the working class was largely excluded. It remained a working class that is underpaid, in a low wage extractive economy. And the problem also is that, the ANC then set about to demobilize this very politicized, highly organized working class that was there, that it found in 1994, a working class that built itself up in struggle against apartheid capitalism. And so gradually it dismantled the civics in the townships, the popular structures, the street committees, and the self-defense committees and so on that had arisen in the townships. And then it started dismantling the student organizations. The Congress of South African Students hardly exists anymore. The South African, that was at the high school and primary school level. At the university level, the equivalent organization largely doesn't exist anymore. The trade union movement has fractured. The unions are not as strong as they've been before. And a part of that has to do with the way in which capitalism has attacked the working class through what we call labor broking in South Africa and subcontracting. And basically what happens there is that the big corporations no longer employ workers as their direct employees. Instead, they outsource the labor to subcontractors. And in this way, people take unemployed people, they organize them into a group, and then they rent them out to capital as cheap labor. Generally the workers who are subcontracted in that way are considered general workers, and they don't have the same wage levels. They can't belong to trade unions like formal workers do, and basically they have destroyed the backbone of the trade unions in the country. But apart from that, the mineral resource base of the country is basically shrinking. We've been mining since 1868, and in so doing, many minerals are in the process of becoming depleted. So if you look at Johannesburg, for example, all along Main Reef Road, where you had the old historic mines and so on, all those mines are shut down. There are 6,000 abandoned mines in the country. And these big corporations, when they abandon mines, they also abandon the workers. And so you find these huge, big squatter camps or informal settlements on these old mines. And you have a lot of these former mine workers too poor to go back to the countries of origin, that is Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and so on. And so they remain behind, and they become informal miners, and they call themselves zamazamas, and they work these old mines in very dangerous conditions that they find themselves in. And so really the working class has been weakened very, very significantly. And I think that the main trade union federation, COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, split into two, and there's now a separate federation called SAFTU, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, as opposed to the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And a lot of the unions split up in between these two federations as well. And so the old National Union of Mine Workers, which was very powerful in the 1980s, is now but a shadow of itself. It's no longer the union that it used to be. The public sector unions are also under threat at the moment. They are under threat from automation and artificial intelligence and so on. You know, a lot of public sector workers are losing their jobs, people like secretaries and typists and so on. And the public service itself is really, really struggling as well. And this is where the Nahawu strike comes from. Now, the Youth League of the ANC called for the nationalization of mines in the mid-1990s, and the ANC would have none of it. The ruling class would have none of it. The mine owners would have none of it. And so basically, the ANC expelled its own youth league from the organization, and they then went on to form the Economic Freedom Fighters. And you know, the guys who are in that organization are very interesting because they came up through the ANC structures and so on, also through the democratic structures of the 1980s, which were not ANC necessarily at the time, but aligned themselves with the ANC after 1994. So Julius Malema came as a political organizer from primary school in the Congress of South African Students, right through the South African Congress of Students, SASCO, the university version of the same, and of course then the ANC Youth League. So he has a very long history of township struggle. If we look at Floyd Shivambu, the same story. Now, the other interesting thing about them is that as an organization, they pride themselves on acquiring qualifications and university degrees and that sort of thing. But what is interesting about that is that they all go through university and they come out with a very strong influence of Marx, Lenin, Fanon, Guevara, Castro, and so on. You know, they really associate themselves with third world struggle heroes, as well as you know, the classical Marxist philosophers and writers and activists and so on. And the entire political strategy has been to disrupt the ruling party as much as possible and to expose the contradictions the ruling party finds itself in with regard to mining, with regard to general politics in the country, with regard to the youth, with regard to unemployment, with regard to transformation in the society and so on, of which there's been precious little. And those disruptive politics that they've had, they take it right into Parliament, and they make it almost impossible for the president to address Parliament altogether. And they've had to be thrown out of Parliament, which again backfires on the ruling party, in the sense that the ruling party has to employ security forces in Parliament, which is not a place where you should be employing those forces. So there's a lot of political theatre going on as far as the EFF is concerned. And because they are so militant, they are so outspoken and challenging, they really appeal to the youth, because people are tired of being submissive. They are tired of just accepting the reality as it is at the moment. Now, the interesting thing is that the mainstream media has labeled the EFF as fascist. Now, it really doesn't hold to label this organization as fascist. They say, well, they wear red uniforms, therefore they're fascist. You know, there's no understanding of what fascism is in this country. You know, fascism is an alliance between big corporate power, big government, in what one can call a social compromise almost, where the government also has its own trade union movement, in which workers take directives from corporations and big business. Now, the EFF really doesn't have much support from big business in the country. They do get funds from some of the fringe businesses that are kind of sailing right on the edge of legality, like people who smuggle tobacco and that sort of thing. Whereas the ruling party and the main opposition party get most of their funding from Anglo-American corporation, from the big banks and big business in the country. And so it's a very interesting situation that has evolved. And given that as we are sitting here, my lights may go off at any time because we have load shedding, because the ANC has not maintained the electricity infrastructure in the country since coming to power. So all the power stations are basically falling apart. And then they built two very useless power stations with World Bank money. And like the World Bank has done in the Philippines and elsewhere, they invested heavily in projects that are not viable, just to indebt the country, so to speak, and make sure that it remains within the sphere of influence of the Washington consensus. And so the EFF has taken that particular issue and the massive corruption within the ruling party as the calling cards in the stay away that took place a week ago. Now, everybody claims victory and everybody says that the other side was defeated. Now, from where I'm sitting, I think that the whole exercise was quite a big success, in the sense that the ruling party was forced to call out the military, spend 166 million in one day, putting up roadblocks, trying to prevent people from getting to the marches, interfering with the bus services that the EFF have hired to take people to the marches and things like that, to try and blockade it. But I can tell you, no one went to work on on that particular day. Now, the problem with South African activism is that we often have one-day stayaways, and I don't really see the value of a one-day stayaway, because it doesn't really impact on the pockets of the ruling class, and therefore they can survive the one-day stay-away. The ruling class itself has called for stayaways in the past as well, against the government of Jacob Zuma, which was also very corrupt, but the clash there was between different factions of capital, one faction originating in Asia, and then the traditional settler colonialist faction, which owned the mines and so on, which did not want to see this new Asian faction coming into the play of things. We have a very highly monopolized economy. There's very room for new entrants in that economy, and those who dominate that very highly monopolized economy they are very hostile to any new entrants into the situation. What is interesting about the stay away as well, that for the first time the South African Federation of Trade Unions also joined the stay away, and the Pan-Africanist Congress also joined the stay away, and the United Democratic Movement, the UDM, also joined this particular stay away. So for the first time, other parties started joining the EFF, which was never the case in the past. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm trying to open my question session. Okay, there we go. I'm just moving my cell phone closer so that I can read. Right, I see some questions here. The EFF have said that they want to get rid of whiteys numerous times. I don't think that is true. I'm a typical whitey. I'm of my ancestors came here in 1652 to rest and recover, and we are still resting and recovering 600 years later. And I've never felt any threat from the EFF whatsoever. I have engaged with them. I've helped them to draw up their manifestos in elections. I've interacted with them. I have a Facebook page with 30,000 followers. Many of them are EFF people. And I don't think that black South Africans have any hostility towards, well, what happened to my phone now? Black South Africans have any hostility towards white South Africans at all. It is just that people are getting very frustrated and they are getting very irritated with the fact that there's been very little transformation in this country over the last 25 years. I can't hear you guys, but I can see your messages. Can you hear me? Okay, as I said, with regard to the black ruling class, let me answer that particular question. The black ruling class is 27% of the white ruling class, because the legislative changes that have taken place in terms of black economic empowerment is that blacks must participate as 27% shareholders. What the corporations have done is they've made that minimum requirement a maximum requirement. That becomes the ceiling against which blacks cannot pass, or through which blacks cannot pass through. And so we have this very unique situation that under apartheid, the black majority had something like 78% of the, well, the white minority had something like 78% of the land, and or 77%, and the black majority only 13%. Now the black majority basically have access to 27% of the economy only. Now, I don't know if there's any European country, I don't think Norway has a situation where foreigners basically own most of the economy. I don't think Germany has that. I don't think France has that, and so on. But in any case, one is not about nationalism. It is not about foreigners in the country or anything like that. It is all about the working class. And as far as I'm concerned, the only solution in this country would be to actually mobilize the working class as a whole, and to transform the country through changing the ownership of the means of production to social ownership. I see there is a reference to Islamic State. Well, it's very interesting. South Africa, throughout its liberation struggle, never had any problems between Muslim people, Jewish people, Christians, and others. In fact, they still collaborate with each other quite a lot. However, the remnants of the apartheid army, many of them joined the Americans in Iraq. They joined the Americans in Syria. In Iraq, South African mercenaries made up the third largest contingent in that war. Outside of Britain and the United States, they even had more soldiers there than the Australians and the New Zealanders. And that was entirely private soldiers who were remnants of the old apartheid army that went across and fought in those particular wars. Now, my greatest fear is that would invite a situation of retaliation by Islamic extremists and so on. But so far, we haven't seen anything like that. My phone keeps on going off. Where do I think the unrest is going? I'm always amazed by the patience of the majority of the people in South Africa. I wouldn't put up with the kind of nonsense that they put up with in this country. Unfortunately, we no longer have the political consciousness that we had in the 1980s, and the reason for that is that many of those people who were politically conscious were absorbed into the civil service. They were absorbed into the political elite. They were absorbed into the ruling class, and I think that was kind of deliberately done. If you remember, Karl Marx once said that your consciousness is determined by your material conditions, and becoming part of the civil service structures. I worked for government for 10 years myself between 1994 and 2004. And suddenly I had a Mercedes-Benz and a 4x4 swimming pool and a 4-bedroom house until I started seeing, but this is unjustifiable. How can I have all these things when people are so poor in this country? Just the fact that I'm in government making me relatively well off is problematic, And so I resigned from government, and I resigned from that lifestyle. I went back into the townships and into struggle and things like that. But for the majority of people, they now say they didn't join the liberation struggle to be poor. Those people who are now part of the ruling class, those people who have used the state as a platform for private accumulation. And that is why we've got so much corruption. The economy is highly monopolized. The only arena within which you can accumulate capital is through corruption in the state. And that has given rise to the high levels of corruption that we are having, but it's also given rise to the absolutely Philistine position of saying that I didn't join the struggle to be poor. I was in exile for 10 years before 1994. I was in Zimbabwe. I joined the struggle so that we could have a socialist society. And I think that was what we all thought at the time. But the system, the transformed system, the Westminster system of governance that we took over lock, stock and barrel, with American-style elections and lobby groups and that sort of thing, have allowed for comrades who were once very good people and very conscious to be bought off in the process. I don't think that Julius has even said that to the international press. I don't think that Julius has said to the international press that he wants white people to leave. What he said to the international press, and I would support him in this, if there are people that refuse to transform in this country, that refuse to accept a new reality, that refuse to accept the notion that the resource base of this country needs to be shared, that the wealth of this country needs to be shared, that the wealth and the resource base of this country needs to be owned and managed by the working class. The means of production needs to be controlled by the working class, should leave this country. We saw the casino elite in Cuba leaving after the revolution there. We've seen this in many countries where members of the ruling class flee when there's an actual revolution. So I would expect that people would flee, and I think that was what Julius referred to. Basically what he's referring to is that those people who remain absolutely clinging selfishly to the colonially acquired wealth that they have, without wanting to become part of a new reality which is not based on race, should actually leave the country. And then, of course, the other thing is that, I don't know if you've seen the videos and so on of Julius Malema being violently confronted in the streets by white right-wingers trying to beat him up and so on. I can share the video with you if you want to have a look at that. So he's probably one of the politicians who is most at risk in a country where political assassination takes place all the time. Just last night, a leader of informal settlements or squatter camps in the Klerksdorp Potch area got shot in the leg and in the back, narrowly missing his spine. We get people killed. There is an unemployed people's movement here whose leaders get assassinated all the time. Our own activists are attacked all the time. So we are becoming a little bit like Colombia in that sense. We have the same problems with drugs, we have the same problems with unemployment and poverty, and we have the same problems with political assassinations. Okay, with regard to the Freedom Charter, the PAC and Black consciousness organizations, which are perhaps to the left of the EFF, reject the Freedom Charter altogether. You know, they say that the statement "the land belongs to all who live in it" is too vague. You know, the land basically refers to the means of production, and the means of production should really be socially owned and managed. It shouldn't be in private hands like it is at the moment. And so there's a contradiction with the Freedom Charter. But Julius Malema is a charterist. He firmly believes in the Freedom Charter. How was the black bourgeoisie formed? That is a very good question. The black bourgeoisie was formed through the negotiated settlement that took place between 1990 and 1994. And basically, they were promised access to the ruling class. They were promised participation in the economy in return for retaining the cheap labor economy in mining and agriculture in this country. South Africa has amongst the most profitable mines in the world because of the cheap labor system. We have our farm workers are terribly alienated because the conditions on our farms are terrible. The worst thing that can happen to a human being on this planet is to be born to a farm laborer in the South African context. Well, the black elite, how many of them are there in the ruling class? Well, I can tell you, I can name their names. There's Cyril Ramaphosa, who's a mining billionaire. There's his brother-in-law, who's a mining billionaire. There's he's got quite a few relatives that are very big in mining. Then there are many ANC guys, like the Minister of Mining. Well, every single Minister of Mining has been absorbed into that faction of the ruling class, the mining faction. Many of our ministers of the environment have been absorbed into mine ownership and so on as well. If you go and look at the board membership for Anglo Platinum, for example, it has its board chairman, Wally Musa, is a former Minister of the Environment, a former UDF activist in the 1980s and so on. He's now got a company called Lereco Holdings, and he's basically a multimillionaire or billionaire even. My former boss in the Northwest Province, when I was working in the government, the provincial premier of the Northwest Province, Popo Molefe, is huge in coal mining at the moment. You know, and these were all ordinary people. Some of them went to jail, some of them were tortured, some of them were beaten up during apartheid and so on. And now they are fabulously rich people. Where do we think things are going? Well, the organizations that I work with we are trying to revive the class consciousness that was there in the 1980s. But we are starting to get a bit old. You know, we are starting to get a bit weary as well. But we are trying to get into the townships, and we are trying to get the youth mobilized. And I must say that since the Fees Must Fall campaign, when students went into the streets demanding that university education be free, and the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, that's Cecil John Rhodes, the guy who was the architect of the mining and apartheid architecture of South Africa. It wasn't Verwoerd, it was Cecil John Rhodes who was responsible for that. So Verwoerd merely fine-tuned that system. Since that time, there's been a lot of young people that have come through our universities that have become radical again, and many of them have moved into the economic freedom fighters. It has a very big base in the universities in the country. And the other thing, of course, is that, when I was in exile in Zimbabwe in 1989 and 1990, 1991, I thought apartheid would never end. And then suddenly it collapsed. This current system has now been going on, this new apartheid system has been going on for 25 years. And I think that with sufficient pressure and organization and so on, it might also suddenly collapse. As it is, the electricity grid can't hold out anymore. We can get to a situation of a total blackout in this country pretty soon, because the power stations and so on are collapsing due to a lack of maintenance. The railway system in the country has collapsed. People have basically stolen the railway lines off the floor. We don't have trains that are running anymore, except the trains for the wealthy between OR Tambo Airport and Sandton, where the ruling class lives. As for the rest of the trains to Soweto and so on, they are becoming fewer and fewer because the railway system itself is being stripped by scrap metal thieves and so on. When you have a situation of close to 50% real unemployment in a country, people try to make ends meet. And one of the ways that they make ends meet is by stripping every piece of metal they can lay their hands on and selling it to scrap metal dealers. And so if you look at a city like Johannesburg, it is starting to disintegrate under that kind of pressure. Now, the problem is that when there's a collapse like that and there's no political organization on the ground, it can lead to absolute chaos. I think Gramsci referred to it as a time of monsters. That can really, really happen in the South African context, unless we are able to get the working class properly organized. Any other questions? Am I still there? Okay. Well, with regard to issues like trains and public transport, there's no more public transport. Even the bus services have collapsed. There's really no bus services to speak of in this country. The fact of the matter is that the corruption started in 1994. Simply because, like I said before, there's no room in a highly monopolized economy where 5 mining companies export 80% of coal, where 3 mining companies export 90% of platinum, where the gold mining industry is dominated by 5 companies. We basically have 5 big banks. We have 5 big retailers, and we've got about 3 big wholesalers. There's really no room for anyone to emerge in this highly monopolized economy as a capitalist anymore. So it's reached saturation point. And the only way forward is actually to have a revolution, and to have a socialist revolution in the country. And they'll probably shoot me for saying that, but that's really the only way forward. Oh yes, we've got a central bank, but it's privatized. I see the question on central banks. The central bank in South Africa belongs to private investors. Many of them are foreign, and they're a handful of people. They're about 200 people. It doesn't belong to the country. It doesn't belong to the state. Well, I think BLM and ANC, BLM is for me an organization which focuses on race far more than class. And you cannot simply focus on race. You need to focus on race, on class as well. Yes, there is a mining mafia. That is true. And well, there are huge syndicates running in South Africa. There are huge criminal groups operating here. It's a new liberal economy. Anything is for sale. You have to look after your children very carefully, because they will also be sold if you don't keep an eye on them. It's really an extreme form of capitalism. I often think that global capital is experimenting in South Africa to see how far they can go with it, and how much of it they can then export from here to other countries. Well, yes, Europe is getting murdered. It's caught between two capitalist concentrations, one in Russia, one in the United States, and of course it's being abused terribly. But at the same time, Europeans treat African refugees pretty badly. So I don't know how we're going to treat European refugees once the big war break out there, because after the Second World War and during the Second World War, tens of thousands of Europeans fled to Africa, and that might happen all over again. It's interesting that you refer to Rothschild. Our former Minister of Finance is now an auditor with Rothschild. But as far as I'm concerned, you can put a bomb under Rothschild and capitalism will still continue. You can't concentrate on an individual when you should concentrate on a class of people and on a system that gives rise to that class of people. You have to look at the economic base of society, both in South Africa and globally, and then you need to attack that, and you need to actually transform that if you want to succeed in changing society. You can assassinate all the Rothschilds in the world and nothing will change. Yes, UK owns Africa. That's pretty true. Most of our big mining companies are in the same suburb as where your queen has a palace. They are all listed on the London Stock Exchange. They all rub shoulders in London. Under London, there are big vaults of gold, full of South African gold, and so on. I don't think that Europeans built South Africa at all. Black labor built South Africa. The black working class built South Africa. The Europeans were simply just supervisors in that process. And so they were a supervisory class for global capital, whose objective was to accumulate as much wealth from the minerals of this particular country. Tax is theft. Well, we could allow all the capital to flow out of South Africa into London and into Europe without taxing it. So we had the absurd situation where Britain was the biggest exporter of platinum in 2020, but you don't have a single platinum mine. You have Belgium being one of the biggest exporters of diamonds in the world, but they don't have a single diamond mine. It's all African diamonds and so on. Israel, a large part of its GDP comes from diamonds from Africa as well. So those are actually also blood diamonds because they help to arm and keep the Israeli government in power in Palestine. So if we look at Congolese minerals and metals, your cell phones and so on are all from coltan and cobalt and copper and so on from that particular country as well. Africans own very little of Africa. Africans are but labor. Africans are but workers in Africa. And this is what colonialism has done. It's basically trapped people in a situation where they don't own anything in their own continent. And if the African working class should wake up, we would see a lot of things happening in the world. The French are still taxing French-speaking African countries as reparations for having left them with liberation. They pay a liberation tax to France even to this day. And so France would just be another third world country should that tax from Africa dry up. At the moment, Burkina Faso, a former French colony, is one of the richest gold producers in Africa and in the world. If we look at the Congo, it's one of the richest countries in the world on paper with regard to its minerals, but none of that wealth stays in the country. Thanks. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm sorry that the technology didn't work. I hope that Haiku is able to work out the technology. There's a last dynamic that we should look at, and that last dynamic is the dynamic of China. China has entered Africa in a very big way, mostly developmental, especially East Africa and so on. We see lots of schools, hospitals, roads, highways, and other infrastructure being constructed all over East Africa and Central Africa, some in Angola, some in the Congo and so on as well. Interestingly, without a single military boot on the ground and without a single military base on the ground. It's very interesting to note that, because suddenly in places like Nairobi and so on, you see highways and trains, bullet trains and so on, that were never there before, that the colonialists never built during the time that they had colonized Africa. The road between Kinshasa and Lubumbashi in the Congo, the capital city of the Congo, and its minerals province capital, was built by the Chinese, and the Belgians were there for almost 100 years, and they never built.
I think that's the time stopper on the thing. Can you guys hear me now? It looks like he's been cut off. Any case, thanks very much for David. It was a little bit unfortunate with the technology, but next time we'll do a more extensive interview. And thanks for answering all the questions in the sideline from all the people.
Well, can a woman have a penis? Well, they should decide. I look like Eugene Terblanche. Well, if I take out the band in my hair, I look like Karl Marx.
Thanks very much, David. Yeah, I'm going to cut you off now. See you guys all later. Ta-da.